A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Naki. Episode 31-2, Split Mirror of the Attic Stage. To understand the full depth of the Athenian delusion, one must look at how their theater was split into two entirely different psychological weapons. While the chaotic, slapstick mockery of middle comedy was engineered to brainwash the ordinary citizens, giving the penniless harbor rowers and agora merchants a cheap, comforting laugh at the expense of foreign kings, Athens simultaneously maintained an entirely different theatrical universe for those who believed themselves intellectually supreme. This was the realm of tragedy, tragoedia, the highest literary art form of the ancient world. Long before the invention of modern opera, Athenian tragedy functioned as an immersive, grand-scale production where complex, elevated poetry was sung to the haunting, piercing melodies of the allos flute, accompanied by a highly trained, synchronized chorus moving in geometric precision. While comedy belonged to the muddy floor of the marketplace, tragedy was the exclusive sanctuary of the philosophical elite, the affluent chorogoi, and the disciples of Plato's academy. To these self-proclaimed intellectuals, tragedy was a sterile, clinical laboratory for the soul. They gathered in the prestigious stone tiers to analyze the grand cosmic laws of hubris and nemesis. Convinced their superior intellect allowed them to look down upon the raw, messy instincts of humanity with objective detachment. Yet, this high art form was warped by the same tinted lenses as their comedy. In their magnificent musical dramas, elite playwrights did not portray the North with nuance. They transformed it into an intellectualized warning. When they staged ancient myths of Dionysius such as Euripides the Bacchae, the sophisticated elite watched in breathless awe as northern landscapes were framed as terrifying zones of psychological madness. They watched actors sing complex melodies about foreign women tearing kings limb from limb, walking away believing that by putting foreign passion into a beautiful musical structure, they had intellectually mastered it. They convinced themselves that the barbarian North was merely a tragic metaphor to be discussed over wine at symposia. They undervaluated the raw volcanic reality of the world outside their walls, never realizing that while they were busy turning northern turmoil into high art drama, the rising princes of Macedonia were forging a real, merciless ire reality that no amount of Athenian sophistication could ever script or control. In a cramped Athenian scriptorium tucked behind the pottery quarter, the air hung thick with bitter ink, burning tallow, and cheap, unwatered wine. Dionysius paced the limestone floor with the predatory energy of a playwright who smelled profit in a fresh northern grave. No, Thrax. A straight tragedy is a total academic drag, Dionysius declared, waving a cup that slopped dark red drops onto the mosaic. The audience at the city Dionysia wants spice. They want Parodia. Our wealthy choragus expects a crowd that roars with laughter. The demos wants those illiterate fools in Pella to look like absolute buffoons. Let's dissect King Alexander, the second one. He was slaughtered at a royal festival, right? Dancing that ridiculous weaponed warrior dance, the Telesias? Thrax, his assistant, leaned over a low wooden table, his fingers stained black as his stylus scratched frantically against a wax tablet. Yes, master. Right in the middle of a grand royal parade. The dispatches say it was a brutal coup, but for our stage, we can make it a proper mess. Blood splattering over the double flutes, actors tripping over their own robes, soldiers dropping their spears, pure theatrical anarchy. Splendid! The ultimate Athenian weapon, mockery disguised as high art. Dionysius paused, a calculating glint in his eyes. Now for the romantic absurdity. This Alexander was not married, correct? Correct, Thrax muttered, his wrist aching. He had a fiancée, a diplomatic match, but the knots weren't officially tied before he took a Macedonian spear to the ribs. Perfect. Through the brilliant lens of Athenian comedy, we shall make him a lover of men. Dionysius crowed. His engagement? A total sham. A desperate cover-up because he preferred the company of his elite royal guards. We'll draft a scene where the frustrated fiancé chases him across the stage with a wedding wreath, while he is frantically chasing a pretty flute boy. The audience will howl at the sheer lack of democratic self-control. Thrax rubbed his temples, knowing the volatile temper of the theatergoers. The audience will love the scandal, but what about the mastermind? Ptolemy of Aloros was the lead conspirator. That's what the rumors say, but who can track the truth in that northern snake pit? Dionysius took another swig of wine. I heard a rumor that this Ptolemy eventually married the dead king's sister, Eurino, to secure the throne. Thrax grimaced. That's far too confusing for the theater master. The mother is Eurydice. The sister is Eurino. The names are too phonetically similar. The citizens will get lost in the barbarian family tree before the first act is even over. Dionysius leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a wicked hiss. Then let's apply the supreme rules of Athenian storytelling and make it truly scandalous. Forget the sister. We will completely excise the daughter. Let's say Ptolemy married the queen mother herself, Eurydice. A classic Oedipal twist, but with far more backstabbing and padded costumes. Thrax's stylist stopped. He looked up, eyes wide in a mix of horror and admiration. You want Ptolemy to marry his own mother-in-law on stage? Exactly. Dionysius threw his head back and laughed. Ptolemy of Aloros, the ultimate barbarian social climber. We will dress him in the ridiculous padded belly and phallus of our comedic tradition. He woos the aging queen, then plots to kill her firstborn son Alexander, just to torment her. It's grotesque. It's hilarious. It is exactly what the Athenian gaze expects of Macedonia. The suffocating scent of cedar oil and stale sweat hung over the rehearsal stage as Dionysius clapped his hands, demanding the Macedonian palace scenery be brought to life. It was a masterpiece of prejudice, a caricature of Pella that was garish, overdecorated, and dripping with democratic mockery. The actor playing Alexander II stumbled onto the stage, wearing an absurdly oversized golden crown. Clad in a neon pink chiton cinched too tight and carrying a wine cup the size of a wash basin, he threw his arms out. Oh, how I love these northern festivals, he wailed in a warbling falsetto. The unwatered wine, the primitive music, and the lovely flute boys. Where is my fiancé? Tell that poor girl I've gone to, inspect the royal stables. Quite alone. Dionysius climbed onto a bench, urging for more. Bigger. Make his movements softer, more undisciplined. From the shadows, the actor playing Ptolemy emerged. Dressed in cheap, clashing yellows and purples, he brandished an oversized wooden dagger painted vibrant scarlet. He crept toward the oblivious king with absurdly high-kneed steps, winked at the audience, and hissed, "He thinks he's dancing the noble Telesias, but the foolish boy is prancing straight toward his doom. Once he's shuffled off this mortal coil, I'll have the throne, and I'll have his mother. Eurydice is much better at royal embroidery than she is at raising competent sons." Suddenly, the actress playing Eurydice, a male actor wearing a grotesque female mask with sagging features, burst onto the scene. Her wig was a wild thicket of fake green snakes, a deliberate nod to the hatred of northern women and their rumored cults. She let out a piercing shriek. "Ptolemy, my blood-stained new husband. Have you seen my son? He's in the palace courtyards trying to teach our heavy cavalry how to do a theatrical kick turn." Ptolemy caught the actor mid-faint, grinning. "Don't worry, my snake-brained queen. I've sent some northern friends to give him a permanent surprise. He'll be late for the wedding by an eternity." A chorus of assassins in ragged, mismatched tunics leaped from behind the scenery, performing a clumsy ballet around the king. They poked at him with blunt wooden pikes, while the king shrieked about his ruined pink chiton. "Stop! Cut the scene!" Dionysius roared. "The stabbing is too clean. Thrax, fetch the inflated pig's bladder. I want theatrical blood, but make it look like dark wine. I want the audience to smell the slaughter through the absurdity." He stepped back, scanning the garish scenery with satisfaction. This was the true engine of the Athenian mind, a brilliant machine to brainwash themselves and maintain the frantic illusion that their pride sat high above any other nation. Through Parodia, they could laugh away their losses. But it was a fatal blindness. The Athenian gaze saw only what they wished to see, transforming a battle-hardened warrior state into a farce. They poured their hatred of women into the image of a crazy snake-worshipping witch, reducing a girl like the young Polysena, who simply found comfort in the reptiles of her homeland, into a harmless archetype of foreign madness. They used their stage to assure the demos that a nation passing its crown by the dagger could never pose a threat to the elegant mathematics of a democratic lottery. they never calculated the cascade of consequences. While Athens spent its summers laughing at its own manufactured fictions and hiding behind the marble of its intellect, the barbarian North was quietly studying the board. The forces they dismissed as savage were weaponizing, restructuring, and preparing to march. Decades later, when the phalanxes of Macedonia stood victorious over the south, the polished elite of Athens would be forced to realize the shattering truth. The North they had spent a generation mocking on stage had completely outcalculated, outmaneuvered, and utterly conquered them. The Attic Phoenix had simply built its own beautiful intellectual cage, waiting for the barbarians to set it on fire. The dual cities of Athens. The sun had retreated behind the jagged spine of the Acropolis, leaving Athens sweltering in the heavy, lingering heat of midsummer. For weeks, the assembly had been paralyzed by frantic reports from the northern frontier. The Macedonian throne in ashes, the usurper Pausanias threatening vital timber routes, and desperate, late-night pleas for Athenian intervention. The city was a powder keg of political tension, its citizens exhausted by the endless calculations of war and the thinning of their coffers. But as twilight deepened, the rigid, clinical focus of the city began to buckle. The official decrees and the stern voices of the strategist were drowned out by a different, more ancient rhythm. The scholars of the Lyceum spoke of the gods as if they were nothing more than immutable stars in a predictable sky, but in the dark, breathing heart of Athens, the people knew better. They knew of the outsider, the twice-born god whose mother had been consumed by the lightning of Zeus, leaving him to bridge the terrifying divide between the divine and the mortal. Dionysus was not the god of the marble pillar or the measured sentence. He was the liquid chaos of the vine, the fertility of the wild, and the pulse of a world that refused to be disciplined. While the city fathers looked to Apollo for the rigid geometry of the law, the people looked to the god of wine for the only thing the law could never grant, the freedom to stand outside oneself. In the mountains, where the shadows grew long, Histhiasis gathered in the dead of night. There, the social veneer of Athens, merchant, slave, matron, dissolved into the frenzy of the Maenads. Draped in the skins of fawns and crowned with ivy, they did not just worship, they dissolved. They clutched the thyrsus, that fennel stalk tipped with the pine cone of untamed nature, and pursued an enthusiasmus that terrified the city's architects. To drink the wine, to dance until the feet bled, and in the darkest rites, to partake in the omophagia, the tearing of raw flesh, was to reject the armor of civilization. Athens embraced this duality with a desperate, two-faced fervor. By day, they dignified the god with the city Dionysia, sponsoring grand dramatic competitions and choral dithyrambs that transformed madness into the birth of theater. It was a state-sanctioned cage for a primal force, a way to tame the god with masks and scripts. But behind the locked doors of the private mystery cults, the cage didn't hold. There, initiates traded the safety of the public festival for secrets of the soul, whispering of the afterlife in ways the city elders dared not acknowledge. It was this inherent, fluid danger that made the god so feared. He was the antithesis of the hoplite's bronze shield. He was the god who could command a man to tear his own life apart if it meant touching the absolute. And as the city teetered between its grand, rational ambitions and the wine-soaked delirium that pulsed in its streets, the strategist forgot the lesson of the ancient myths. You cannot invite the god of chaos into your home and expect him to respect the lines you have drawn on your maps. This was the height of the festival, and the city had surrendered to a collective fevered delirium. The air in the theater of Dionysus grew thick, saturated with the smell of spilled wine, unwashed bodies, and the dizzying, cloying scent of pine. Men and women, masked in fawn skins, moved in a hypnotic, jagged rhythm that defied the sober geometry of the streets. The frantic piping of all us players cut through the humid air, driving the throng toward ecstatic dissolution. At the center, a group of Maenads spun with such violence that the world blurred into a smear of color. One woman, eyes rolled back, tore at a sacrificial branch with her teeth, a thin line of blood tracking down her chin as she shrieked a name that was half prayer and half curse. The onlookers, merchants and philosophers alike, stood on the perimeter, faces flushed with a mixture of terror and dark envy. "The god is here," a young man muttered, his hand trembling as he reached for a skin of watered wine. "Look at them, they aren't men anymore. They've burned the borders of their own minds." "It's a sickness," an older man retorted, though he didn't turn his gaze away. His voice was unsteady, betraying the thrill that shivered through his own veins as the chanting grew to a roar that vibrated in the very stones of the theater. "It's not a sickness," the youth replied, his voice rising to match the drums. "It's the truth of us. We spend our lives building walls and counting coins, pretending we are made of logic and bronze. Dionysius doesn't care for your borders or your laws. He only wants the mask to drop." The city beyond the theater, with its calculating fleets, felt suddenly fragile, a thin crust over a howling abyss. The fever seeping into the architecture was a reminder that underneath the polished marble of the assembly, the people were still, at their core, creatures of blood and shadow. Inside the assembly hall, the air was stagnant, burdened with the weight of official business. A strategist stood upon the bema, voice strained as he hammered on a podium, demanding funding for the northern campaign. "The Haliacmen is the barrier between order and ruin," he shouted to a chamber of men who seemed more interested in the rising clamor outside than the survival of the timber frontier. "We send Iphicrates to carve a civilization out of the mud. We send steel and gold and blood to secure a contract that ensures Athens will be the architect of the North." He gestured to a scroll on the table, a crisp official treaty with the Argead prince, sealed with the weight of Athenian law. It looked permanent, rational, and cold. Yet, just beyond the thick marble walls, the city was unspooling. A low, guttural roar drifted through the open archways. The strategist faltered, eyes darting toward the window. Outside, the streets were being claimed by a surge of bodies, citizens who had discarded their togas for the skins of mountain beasts. In the shadows of a nearby portico, a group of merchants watched the procession with wary eyes. One of them held a copy of the very treaty being debated inside. "They talk of permanence," the merchant said, his voice drowned out by the shrill piping of the aulos. He gestured toward the frenzied crowd, where men who, by noon, had been litigating property rights, were now tearing at a sacrificial goat with their bare teeth. "Look at them. By dawn, they won't even remember the name of the general they cheered for yesterday." "The treaty is sound," his companion replied, though he gripped his own purse as a group of Maenads sprinted past. "It is signed in ink. It is backed by the law." "The law?" The merchant laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. He pointed to a prominent politician who had just emerged from the assembly, still clutching his scrolls, only to be swept up into the Dionysian current. His scrolls were trampled into the dust, his robes shredded, his face painted with the blood of a wild boar. In the span of a single heartbeat, the architect of the Macedonian alliance had vanished, replaced by a raving creature that knew only the heat of the god. The merchant looked down at the treaty in his hand. The ink was elegant, the strategic vision a masterpiece of Athenian brilliance. But as the sound of the revelry reached a crescendo, shaking the very marble of the city to its foundation, the parchment felt flimsy, a fragile, laughable thing. "They send Iphicrates to build a structure out of long spears and rigid lines in the north," the merchant whispered, his gaze fixed on the chaos that threatened to swallow the street whole. "And back here, they tear down their own souls for the sake of a wine-drenched delirium. They are two different cities. And I would not bet a single copper that the city of the law will outlast the city of the god." He crumpled the treaty into his fist, the edges tearing softly. It was a contract of parchment and ink, signed by men who, in the dark of the night, chose to become beasts. It was worth exactly what the fever was worth: nothing. The weaver of the fever. The Piraeus was a labyrinth of salt, sweat, and desperate ambition, a place where Lysandra of Cyrene had spent years meticulously crafting a life from the shards of her past. Standing in her shop, the air heavy with the sharp scent of crushed rosemary and drying mint, she listened to a local magistrate boast of his influence in the assembly. "Another man who believes the world is built of ink and marble," she thought, her fingers tracing the jagged scar on her forearm. "He speaks of the state as if it were a body, yet he hasn't the faintest idea what a body truly is." She was an expert in the flora of the Mediterranean, the bitter wormwood that purged the gut, the crushed poppies that pulled the veil of sleep over a screaming wound, and the sharp, resinous oils that kept the rot of the city at bay. She understood the fragile rhythmic mechanics of the human pulse with a surgeon's cold clarity. She could map the hidden geography of a fever as surely as a general mapped the terrain of a battlefield. Yet, for all her knowledge, she remained a ghost in the city's ledger. To the law, she was merely a freedwoman, a footnote in the property records of a dead man. existing only by the grace of a manumission scroll that felt more like a leash than a liberation. She lived in the interstices of Athenian life, a woman with a trade but no voice, permitted to touch the skin of the elite, only to stitch their wounds or deliver their heirs, then dismissed back to the shadows as if she were as insubstantial as the smoke from her own herbal fires. The injustice of it burned in her, a quiet, corrosive heat. She craved something far more substantial than the begrudging respect of those whose lives were governed by their fathers' names and their husbands' coins. She craved a power that could not be revoked by a whim, a death, or a legal decree, a power that she would forge herself, from the very chaos that the city fathers were terrified to acknowledge. They are all so fragile, she reflected, her eyes tracking the magistrate as he descended the stone steps, his heavy gait an echo of the self-importance that defined his class. A single fever, a misplaced step on a slick harbor quay, and their sanctity of law is revealed to be nothing but a costume, a thin, painted veil, draped over a collection of failing organs and frantic animal anxieties. She leaned against the cool wall of her shop, her fingers brushing the jars of dried valerian and hellebore. She had spent a decade holding the truth of their mortality in her own hands. She knew the secret rattling sound of a lung failing in a chamber of gold. She knew how the smell of gangrene ignored the rank and station of a general. I am the one who stitches their ruin back together, she thought, the bitterness sharpening into a cold, lethal focus. I mend the flesh so they can go back to their podiums and pretend they are made of bronze. They see me as an instrument, a pair of hands that knows which knots to tie and which oils to burn, but never a mind that understands the structure of their own decay. They are the architects of the theater, yet they are entirely oblivious to the fact that their grand civilization is a house built of rotting timber, held together by nothing more than the collective agreement to never look beneath the surface. She picked up a silver needle, turning it over in the low, dusty light. It was sharp, cold, and indifferent. I'm the one who stitches them back together, yet I remain beneath them, she whispered to the empty room. There must be a way to be the one who holds the needle. If they are the fabric, then I shall be the hand that dictates the pattern, and if I pull the right thread, I will watch their entire, fragile design unravel at my feet. The rumors of the Dionysian cult were a rhythmic thrum in the back of her mind. To the city, these whispers were the death rattle of reason, a dangerous delirium to be feared. But to Lysandra, it sounded like a different language of power, one translated for her in the broken, fevered confessions of her patients. Her investigation began with a healer's detachment. She went as a ghost, cloaked in a dark mantle, moving through the fringes of the city Dionysia, with eyes that mapped the revelers with clinical precision. Look at them, she thought, watching a group of aristocratic women break from their chaperones. Their movements aren't random. They are hyperventilating to force the blood to the brain, inducing a self-inflicted hypoxia. They are literally starving their rational minds of the very oxygen needed to maintain the illusion of order. She watched a woman fall into a violent, rhythmic dance. She isn't mad, Lysandra noted. She's physically overriding her own social programming. If I could map the stimulus, the pitch of the alas, the repetition of the beat, I could calculate the precise moment the self shatters. You stare hard for a woman who doesn't drink, a raspy voice interrupted. It was an elderly midwife, a fixture in the harbor. I am a healer, Lysandra replied, her tone level. I watch to see what the body does when it believes the mind has let go. The old woman let out a dry, rattling laugh. You think you're watching the body, girl? You're watching a fire. Stand too close and you'll start to crave the burn. The burn, Lysandra mused, her eyes tracking the surging crowd. They are destroying themselves, and in that destruction, they are becoming absolute. If they can be unmade and remade by a song, what could I do if I held the reins of that process? What if I didn't just watch the fever, but authored it? I don't crave the burn, Lysandra whispered. No, the old woman countered. Then why do your hands shake? You're not looking for a cure. You're looking for a weapon. Lysandra didn't answer. She simply turned her gaze back to the revelers, her fingers tracing the empty air as if she were already holding the threads of their collective madness. She realized then that they were bypassing the logic of the mind to reach the marrow of the god. When she finally stepped into the suffocating heat of a private, nocturnal gathering, she felt the pulse of the earth through her own soles. This is the truth, she thought, her pulse quickening as the alas shrilled. If I can understand the mechanism of their release, I can govern it. The woman lying in the dirt was Elpenus, wife to a prominent strategist. In the light of day, she was a statue of Athenian virtue. Here, she was a frantic heap. Her limbs jerked in violent spasms as the intensity of the enthusiasmus threatened to shatter her nervous system. The other Maenads recoiled, fearing the god had chosen to punish her. Lysandra moved through the circle, her footsteps silent. Too much voltage, Lysandra thought, observing the erratic, gasping rhythm of Elpenus' chest. The social constraints of her life are a dam. When it breaks, the rush of the god is drowning her. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the precise intersection beneath the jaw, where the vagus nerve lay vulnerable. With a precise pressure, she clamped down. The thrashing stopped instantly. The woman's body went rigid, then softened into a rhythmic, divine trance. "The god accepts your service," Lysandra whispered, her voice a melodic anchor. "Release the fear. You are not the wife of a general here. You are the vessel." Elpenus's eyes snapped open, glowing with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "I see," she breathed. "The walls, they are made of water. I am everything." Yes, Lysandra thought, a cold, dark satisfaction blooming like a black flower. "You are everything, and I am the one who knows how to open you. I'm the key to the cage." She walked out of the forest that night, the sharp scent of pine resin and the iron tang of sacrifice clinging to her hair. The city of marble and law awaited her below, glowing like bleached bone under the moon. They spend their lives debating what they own, never realizing that they do not even own their own minds, she mused. They rely on the stability of their laws, but I have found the instability in their blood. Lysandra of Cyrene is a servant, she told herself, the name feeling like a dusty, discarded cloak left behind on the forest floor. But Semele? Semele, the priestess of the fire, she would be the one to hold the torch. She would orchestrate the fever that made the marble crack and the laws wither into ash. She would decide when the city burned, and she would make sure that when it did, the Athenian elite would finally understand exactly what it meant to lose control. To be continued in episode 32, Sparta, Wounded Lion. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.